Good afternoon. Hello to all the members of the Williams College community. My name is Leticia Smith-Evans Haynes. I'm an alumna from the class of 1999. I currently serve as Vice President for the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Williams, where I and the wonderful team in the office work tirelessly to root out structural racism, sexism, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQI discrimination, just to name a few, while advancing equal access to opportunities for people regardless of their identities. We'll start the program by acknowledging the legacy of displacement of Indigenous Mohegan people on the lands upon which Williams College is built. The college resides on the ancestral and spiritual lands of the Mohegan people, and we pay respect to the Mohegan elders, past and present, by acknowledging this troubled history. I want to thank the college's alumni relations team and the Claiming Williams Committee for being a part of Claiming Williams Day and for bringing this program together in particular. This year's Claiming Williams theme is From Racial Injustice to Restoration. So throughout the day, members of our community have aimed to explore the ways in which structural racism on and off campus has shaped the experiences of students, faculty, and staff. This year, there was some diligence around including alumni voices in the conversation, particularly because it is this year that we mark the 200th anniversary of the founding of the Williams College Society of Alumni. We're spending this bicentennial year not only celebrating and grappling with our past, but also examining our present and imagining our future as we work toward an inclusive society where all alumni feel they belong. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. If you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time. We've dedicated time for Q&A, so feel free to submit your questions as they come to you as you think of them. The session is 90 minutes long, and you should come and go as you must, and we thank you in advance for spending whatever time you're able with us. And please note again that we are recording today's session for future access. I'm going to introduce our panelists, all of whom have experience working in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice space. And I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us and giving your time on Claiming Williams Day and really every day, considering the work that you do. So we're joined first by Sabine Chishty, class of 2012. Sabine is a teacher, an advocate, and a coach who supports individuals and organizations to dismantle racism in New York City's education system. Today, she leads several equity efforts, strategic planning, training, and a whole lot more for more than 1,300 staff who are members of the city's Division of Early Childhood Education. And her role there is Special Projects Manager. She also teaches graduate courses at Brooklyn College on diversity and organizational effectiveness and partners with various organizations as an equity consultant. And she works on occasional, as an occasional sensitivity reader for 4 Doors Travel. So welcome, Sabine. I also want to introduce Allie Michael, class of 2000. Allie's the author of Raising Race Questions, Whiteness, Inquiry, and Education, which was the winner of the 2017 Society of Professors of Education Outstanding Book Award. In her capacity as the co-director of the Race Institute for K-12 Educators, she works with schools and organizations across the country to help make the research on race and education more accessible to educators. She's co-editor of the best-selling Everyday White People Confront Racial and Social Injustice, 15 Stories, and also the best-selling Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys. Welcome, Allie, and thank you for being with us. And we're also joined by Sharifah Wright, class of 2003. Sharifah is an equity, diversity, and inclusion leader who's got over 15 years of experience engaging and supporting underrepresented, disenfranchised, and marginal communities, not only in higher education, but in government and nonprofit sectors in Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean. She is the inaugural executive director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusive Engagement at Ontario Tech University in Ontario, Canada. And she previously served as the director of Alumni, Diversity, and Inclusion at Williams College and project manager for UN Women Gender Equality Programs in the Office of the Prime Minister in Kingston, Jamaica. She's a proud member of the Williams Black Alumni Network, a former member of the Executive Committee of the Society of Alumni, and currently serves on the board of the Institute for Quantitative Study of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. So thank you and welcome to all of you. And we're going to begin with brief reflections from each of you, Sabine, Ali, and Sharifa, before opening the program up for conversation and questions and answers. Sabine?
Thank you so much, Leticia. Hi, Sabine Chishty, class of 2012. Excited to be here and appreciate the opportunity. A brief but likely familiar in these times warning. I do have 2 cats and a dog, so if you hear any chaos in the background, that's why. So I will dive right in. Leticia talked about the work I do now, so I don't think I need to recap that. But I know one thing that we were asked to kind of think about and come to, and I think I would have appreciated not that long ago when I was a student at Williams, is to also be talking a little bit about how I ended up in this work myself. I think for context, I am Atlanta born, Chicago bred, and have been in New York for about 9 years. I'm the child of Bangladeshi immigrants. My dad actually came to America to go to Williams, class of '84. And I grew up as a K through 12 private school scholarship kid in the south side of Chicago, in a school that was quite literally half white and half Black, and me. And I name all of that because I think I grew up with a somewhat unique front row seat to seeing a lot of how racial bias played out at a personal level and interpersonal level. And that is a lot of what drove my interest in thinking about those inequities and racial justice. When I got to Williams, it opened my eyes to the fact that that inequity spectrum was about 100 times bigger than I had ever realized in my middle class bubble. And that coupled with working at all of the local schools and realizing how much I love teaching and being in this dynamic role ended up seeming like a perfect marriage of the things I wanted to do, right? Being able to pursue social justice and racial justice and doing so on a human dynamic level. I share that because I think teaching for me created the kind of revelation that I think a lot of us often have to undergo in DEI work, which is realizing that if what is most important to you is actually serving the people you're trying to serve, that has to be more important than your pride. And that means you have to do a lot of the reflection and grappling with the biases we've been socialized to uphold to actually align our intentions with our impact. And so I spent 4 years teaching in the Bronx, aggressively doing curriculum on race and identity and equity, and taking those as opportunities to also really be challenging the oppression within myself that I was upholding too. When I left, for the same way I think so many folks do, it was to understand more about how to challenge the systemic oppression that led to the classrooms being under-resourced, to students who deserved a lot more not getting it. And I took a bit of a circuitous path, which I think is important to share, because I think a lot of us often feel, especially as type A, at least for me, Williams students, that you need to have sort of a straight career path. And I learned a lot about how to think about this work from different angles. I worked in public policy in DC. I trained as a community organizer here in New York and New Jersey. And I came to a nonprofit, Leadership for Educational Equity, that really focused on developing current and former public school teachers with a focus on folks from marginalized backgrounds to become civic leaders, to be able to be the folks who are changing systems. That also was a space where I had a reckoning. I think a lot of folks who have worked, especially, but not exclusively in nonprofits have, which is being in an organization that is doing work that deeply aligns with my values and the work of DEI, but internally hasn't actually reached a state of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that focus actually on the internal, on the organizational, is what brought me about 2.5 years ago to the Division of Early Childhood now, where I lead a whole suite, kind of the whole kit and caboodle of DEI, racial equity work in particular. To name a couple things that I have found useful to share from doing this work, I think one that feels important to mention to me is the way that my identity as a South Asian American empowers me, frankly, in anti-racist work in particular. obviously, I grew up in post 9/11 Midwestern America. It's not always a privilege to be walking with that identity. But I think I name this because often we umbrella lump people of color into one category. And while many folks of color experience a lot of racism and oppression together, there are also privileges in terms of what I'm able to do with my voice and who is able to hear me and listen to me and respect me. That isn't always true for my Black and Latinx colleagues. And I raise that because that to me is critical to actually doing the work to the best of my ability. Some of the other things I just want to highlight are, from doing this work, I talk with folks a lot about, it is both personal constant debiasing, and it is also unlearning a lot of the stories that oppression tells us to keep itself alive. I often talk in my executive coaching with folks about myths of oppression in particular, that when you follow them to their logical end, don't really hold water, but are so familiar to so many of us that we turn to them, especially when confronted with DEI work or inequities, reflexively. And those are myths like, we live in a meritocracy, there are good non-racist people and a handful of evil racist people. The work is so complex that no one could possibly know where to start. And I think somewhat most saliently, the idea that DEI work means some folks gain and other folks lose, which isn't true. And that is a whole other shtick to go down, but it is something I quite literally teach the class on, which is that DEI is good for absolutely everyone involved on a personal level, on a business level, on a community level, and everything else. I think some of the other things just to name that I have found really important. One is, unsurprisingly, relationship building is essential to the work, especially when you are doing it from inside the system. Folks can't do that humble, vulnerable, difficult, challenging of their own biases without having the relationship with someone who they can be that open with. I think the other thing to name is that DEI often gets boxed into something that is separate from other work, when in fact, the only way we actually get to diversity, equity, and inclusion is with everyone's work. If it's useful, sometimes I ask folks to think about it like environmental sustainability, right? That it's good that there are full-time roles and organizations and agencies dedicated to environmental sustainability, but we only actually make it work. We only actually protect the environment when everyone is thoughtfully and capably chipping in. I will skip past some of these things, mostly because I have no idea how much time I have taken up so far. And to bring it into this year and the context that we are talking in and working in and here together in, I think, of course, it has been a unique year, not necessarily in terms of racial injustice existing, happening, harming people, murdering people, but in terms of how profoundly the conversation has shifted nationally and in so many spaces, frankly, faster than I would have predicted a few years ago. And I think for me, as someone who has been in this sector for a while now, although I'm the baby of this panel, I think there is deep gratitude that there is so much more awareness of structural racism, that the fact that the word anti-racism has become so pervasive is still a little bit mind-blowing to me. And I know that for me and for many folks who have been doing the work, it can also feel, there can be an exhaustion that comes with, eventually having folks recognize and grapple with something that many of us have been trying to champion for so long. And I name that not to, complain. It's not we said it first, but I think to name that if you are someone who is experiencing a lot of this year as something of a revelation, it can be helpful to be cognizant of the folks for whom racism and structural oppression have been an ongoing lived experience, who do not share your surprise. And I think the big thing has been that there are efforts towards progress. Things are changing. That is always good. And for me, it is always important to keep pushing folks to make sure that we are not simply talking the talk or posting the things or anything else, but truly changing behavior. I think I often use Beverly Tatum as a useful metaphor in this space, where she talks about racism as a moving walkway, which is to say, there are the active racists who walk forward, who accelerate along the moving walkway. There are the passive folks who stay still, but still advance and benefit from and uphold and live in this system, even without acting. And there are anti-racists who walk in the opposite direction. And so I think I've spent a lot of this year encouraging folks to do the reading, do the learning, speak up, but also really think about the power you have in the spaces you occupy, your purchasing power, where you buy from, the way you think about your colleagues at work, whose voices you amplify, the way you engage with your community, and so much else. And the last thing I'll name before I pass to Ali is just to share a little bit of joy. I think I've seen really powerful pressure for organizations, for people, for leaders to do better. It's been really powerful to see appetite for that personal debiasing and action, both from my graduate students at Brooklyn College, as well as a lot of the former teachers and current teachers who I have worked with and alongside, which is already benefiting their students. And I think the last thing I'll name is, for me, it has been a year where, because there is additional momentum, it has given people like me an opportunity to do more in the organizations we work in. Last spring, when, of course, there was a lot of political momentum, I was able to lead an event for about 900 of our staff, where 92 of them volunteered to lead small groups in a community organizing tool, which is wild, and even wilder. It worked and went well, but it was a chance to quite genuinely ask a lot of folks who never get to have their voice at the table what the organization needs to do, and we're translating that into a long-term strategic plan. And that is among so many things I candidly don't know that I would have guessed could happen this year if you'd asked me a few years ago. So it's complicated, but I'm excited to be here talking about it, especially from two alums I'm excited to learn a lot about. And with that incredibly smooth transition, I will pass the mic to Ali.
Thanks, Sabine. It is really an honor and a pleasure to get to learn from you today, and to learn from Sharifa and Leticia today, and to be with alum, which I don't always do. So thanks everybody for having me. I want to start off by just talking about my journey into anti-racism, because the truth is, when I got to Williams, I was not on an anti-racist journey. That's not where I was headed in my life. As a college freshman, in fact, Williams has a requirement that you take a diversity credit in order to graduate. And so there are a series of courses that qualify you to have taken this diversity credit. And I took a course called African American Literature with Dr. Grant Farrad. And to be totally honest, I'm not sure I would have taken the course if it hadn't been required. And it's not because I wasn't interested in the material, and it's not because I wasn't excited about it. It's because I didn't feel like I belonged. I didn't really think I would have anything to contribute, or I would be useful in the conversation. And so I'm actually a big fan of requirements, especially when it comes to diversity, because there can be so many reasons why white people in particular, like me, say, I know I might not be helpful. I might not know what to say. And in fact, I went into this class and we started talking about Blackness and whiteness and white supremacy and white savior mentality. And I remember thinking, every time someone said white, I remember thinking, are they talking about me? Because I had never really thought about myself as white. And I realized in that class, I couldn't say the word Black. And race is not just about white and Black, obviously, but in that particular class, that was a lot of what we were talking about. And I couldn't say the word. In my family, if we said anything about somebody who was Black, it was like Black, or like, or you would say first, oh, I wanted to tell you about my colleague who's beautiful and kind and smart and thoughtful and Black. And, you know, it was like, you have to have all these positive adjectives because you can't just say Black, that, you know. And so I got into this class and I realized I have no skill for talking about race. I don't know what to say. I trip over my words. I turn bright red and feel confused every time I try to talk. And then I get, I realized that I've never had a Black teacher before. I've never had Black classmates. I grew up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh and went to a public school in a community that was 99.8% white. And I wouldn't have said that at the time. If you asked me, did you grow up in a segregated community? I would have said, no, it wasn't segregated. There were lots of people of color in my community. They all went to school with us. But the truth is I didn't have the skill at the time to zoom out and see that I lived in an almost all white community, 10 miles away from an almost all Black community. And we never mixed and we didn't know each other. And we never went to the Black communities in Pittsburgh. So I grew up in a town and in a family where by and large, what I learned about racism is that we should be colorblind. We shouldn't talk about race. We should just, we're all the same. Everybody has an equal shot, and just, you know, it's actually racist to talk about racism. So here I am in freshman African-American literature, and I have to talk about race, but I have all of this physiological resistance to it. My body's actually saying like, don't do it. It's wrong to do that, because that was how I was socialized. And so honestly, if you had told me then that I would be speaking on a panel like this, I mean, that would have terrified me. But there were a couple of important things I learned that semester. One thing that I learned was that you can get better at this. You can be really bad at this. And the more you talk and the more you engage and the more you learn, the better you get. It's a skill. Racial competency is a skills-based competency that grows the more you practice. And I always thought like, oh, people of color are good at talking about race because they were like born being able to talk about race. And white people are no good at it because we obviously weren't. We weren't born that way. You know, I had this like very biological conception of the skill of talking about race. And it was partly in that class where I started to realize it's not about being a person of color or being white, it's about practicing. And Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color tend to get more practice because it's not rare for them to wake up in the morning and have racism on their doorstep. You know, this metaphorical box that they have to contend with, and to ask like, oh, does my mother know this is here? I want to make sure my kids know this is here. They're going to have to deal with this today. Let me call my neighbor, see if they're okay. Let me call my brother, see if he's okay. Whereas as a white person, largely in intimate relationships and family relationships with other white people, racism isn't dropped on my doorstep and wasn't for most of my life. So I haven't been forced to contend with it. I wasn't forced to contend with it until I was a freshman in college. And at that point, I decided I wanted to contend with it more. There were a couple other things that happened this year that led me in that direction. One, that year, there was a moment when I heard this quote from James Baldwin, who said, racism's not actually a people of color problem. It's really a white person problem, and it's not going to change until white people do something about it. And so here I am sitting in this class thinking, this is my problem. I have to do something about this. And the remarkable thing is the way I grew up, the way I thought about racism, this fits in really nicely with Sabine's metaphor of the moving walkway. I just thought racism was like something over there that people of color had to deal with. And it's, you know, I can feel empathetic that they have to deal with it. I can feel sad about it, but like, we're not racist. So, you know, we don't use racial slurs. So it has nothing to do with me. And, you know, I'm just sorry that people of color have to deal with it. I think that's the way that I thought about it. And this class made me realize, no, racism structures our entire society. And this is something I've benefited from every day of my life. If you had asked me at the beginning of freshman year, how much does racism impact your life? I would have said it doesn't. And now what I realize is that, I grew up in an all white space. All white spaces don't happen by accident. They happen because of very intentional social and public policy that keep people of color out of those spaces, that make it hard for Black people to get mortgages in predominantly white spaces, that make it hard for homeowners to sell, they have housing covenants that bind them to selling homes to white people. There were lots of different, and there was also just like general weirdness around people of color that probably kept people out of the community, and over policing in my community. There's so many things that went into keeping my community all white, to keeping it literally a segregated community. And I had never thought about the fact that being white was what made it possible for me to live there, was what made it possible for me to go to these schools that were #1 in the state, or, to live in a house that my parents could sell and then make enough profit to help pay for my education at Williams. So being white has impacted me every day of my life. And in that class, I started to realize that this is my problem. And so for my life, my lifelong inquiry, which I'm still engaged in today, is asking that question: if racism is my problem as a white person, what do I do about it? And I I continue to learn, and then I continue to follow my instinct as I continue to learn. And my professional work changes over time, but that is still the core of the question. The other thing that I heard that year, let me look at my notes, was somebody leaned over and said, "So what about you, Allie, what's your racial story?" And again, I was like so flabbergasted, like, I don't have a racial, what, do white people have racial stories? And that was the other thing. So I fumbled my way through that question, but I thought, I want to spend time figuring out what my racial story is. And so I spent time at Williams continuing to learn about African-American literature. I actually studied African history as a concentration, and spent over 9 months of my time at Williams in Cape Town, South Africa, which was in 1998, right after apartheid had ended, and continued to learn about what the violence and the terror of state-sponsored, state-enforced racism. And there was a point early on in my career, I started teaching, and I realized this isn't it. I want to study race and education, and I want to study whiteness and education. I want to know everything I can about what my racial story is, and how racism is my problem, and what I'm going to do about it. So I had this vision. I want to study whiteness and education. And when I applied to my doctoral program, people said, "Don't tell them you want to study whiteness and education, because they won't let you in." And I remember thinking, like, well, why would I want to go there if they're not going to let me in? But I had an advisor who said to me from my master's program, who said, the thing is, like, whiteness, she was a great advisor on so many counts, but she said whiteness studies was done in the 90s. I don't think anybody's gonna want you to study whiteness. And I just kept thinking, like, if whiteness was done, like if we're done academically with whiteness, wouldn't the world look different? If we knew everything there was to know about whiteness, wouldn't things have changed more? So in my doctoral program, they said to me, the one that I graduated from, they said, "We can't teach you about whiteness, but you can study it here. We want you to come and we want you to learn." And so I spent years studying whiteness and studying Blackness, actually, because I had a mentor, Dr. Howard Stevenson, who was a psychologist who really helped guide my research on whiteness. And I took all of his classes as well. And at the end, I graduated with no idea I didn't qualify for anything. I mean, every job I looked at, I thought, these are all jobs that people of color should have, first of all. I didn't want to go into academia because I felt like if I go into academia, I'm going to have to, like, the incentive in academia is to get you to write research articles that are generally inaccessible to the general public and to my particular audience, which was educators and counselors. And then, like, the jobs that I maybe could do with, like, leading Res Life was I still didn't qualify for it because I didn't have 5 years of experience. So it was like, I have studied for 7 years whiteness in education, and I'm not qualified to do anything. And so I just decided, you know, I'm just gonna start doing workshops. I'm gonna start leading workshops, and people who want to come can come. And if I can make more than $30,000 the first year, then I'm gonna keep doing it. And that first year, I just said yes to everything I could, that anybody asked me to do. I did all kinds of random stuff that was not related to whiteness in education. And over time, I built up a practice in which schools use me as an educator for their faculties, to think about how racism is manifesting in their classroom and how they can do things differently. And I think one of the things that is, you know, it doesn't always make sense to bring in a white anti-racist educator. Sometimes that's exactly not what schools need. And I try very hard to make sure that when I work with schools, that I have an accountability partner in their system who is a person of color, who is able to say, yes, this is the moment that we need you now. Because I don't want to be, you know, if people are just more comfortable listening to a white person talk about race, I don't want to, that might not be the right place for me. But if a person of color calls me and says, we need your perspective, we need our faculty, which is 85% white, to see a white person talking about racism so that they can know what it looks like, so they can feel more free to do it themselves, then that is a job that I will take. And so again, my work today really involves working with educators to make the research on race and whiteness in education something that they can use in their classrooms, and helping other white people continue to ask that question of how is racism my problem? And how am and what can I do about it? Because there's lots of things that I don't know about racism and that I can't know because I'm not a person of color. And so I'll never know really what it feels like to grow up in a society so heavily shaped by race and racism. As a person of color, I won't know that. And yet there's so much I have to do and I have to say. And so my goal is to continue helping white people ask that question and to do so on my own. So I'm going to pass it now to Sharifah Wright, who is the class of 2003. Thanks, everybody.
Of course, I had to be prompted to unmute. This is perhaps the 10th time today that I had to be prompted to unmute. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharifah. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm currently situated on land that is covered under the Williams Treaties of Canada. It's a traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Great Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today and to be a part of the Claiming Williams program. I know how much work goes into pulling Claiming Williams together, and so my gratitude to everyone in the Alumni Relations Office, in the VP EDI's office, as well as folks on the committee who pulled this day together. I'm going to spend my time today talking about archive and memory and rememory, and how the pursuit of reparation became important to me, and ultimately how that led to my career. Much like Sabine, that's my doorbell. Hi, Pure Later Guy. I have a very peripatetic journey that took me here. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is, because I think it's important. You know, as Sabine said, for students and alums and anyone to know that very rarely are our lives, professional and otherwise, mapped out in a straight line. And ultimately, you know, I found with me doing this work that is focused on building communities and creating spaces that are more equitable, more accessible, more inclusive than they were in the past, I've always had an interest in it. So, you know, I've been cognizant and aware of race, racism, the different dimensions of it, as long as I can remember. I don't remember not knowing about race, and I don't remember not being inquisitive about race. You know, I had the benefit of parents who were not only committed and focused to helping us understand these dynamics, but they also allowed me to be a curious and inquisitive, nosy, and quite frankly, obtrusive child. And you know, and that was cultivated in many ways throughout my kind of K through 12 journey. And when I got to Williams, I realized that unlike, you know, my time before Williams, I didn't have any sense of history of the place. I didn't have any way of connecting to the place because I didn't know anything about, I knew nothing about Williams when I came to Williams, nothing. I didn't even know where Williams was. My parents thought it was going to be in Boston. It was this whole thing. Didn't want to go to Williams. I promised myself I wouldn't tell that story. So it was really hard for me to connect with it as a community. You know, growing up, knowing the history of Jamaica, knowing particularly the racial history of Jamaica was something that was consistently reinforced in my education, both at home and at school. And I certainly had a sense of what the racial politics and the kind of intersectional politics of life was at Williams, but some of it really shocked me. I definitely had a sense of culture shock. And now I often look back at things that I experienced at Williams that were deeply racist, deeply racialized, and they completely flew over my head, because although I had an understanding of race and how my Blackness impacted my existence and the existence of people around me, there are ways in which the very specific nature of being a Black woman at a predominantly white school, wealthy, elite in the middle of nowhere, Massachusetts, just completely like went over my head. And I say that because I think in many ways, when I think about what draws me to this work, but also what makes me frankly good at this work, I call it my superpower, but also people may read it as some kind of social deficit. I have far more interest in the macro dynamics of people than I do in the micro dynamics of people. Love as justice than love as I knew this was going to happen. Oh, I am frozen, but can someone from Williams tell me if I'm not frozen anymore? Can someone in the chat let me know when I started to freeze?
You're fine.
Okay.
You were saying you're more interested in the macro dynamics than the micro dynamics. I think that's hard to cut out.
Thank you, Ali. And so oftentimes when I was thinking about or confounded by, or really sometimes delighted by, you know, the conversations around race that were happening at Williams. And when I was at Williams, you know, we're talking about 1999 to 2003. In 1999, Amadou Diallo was murdered, you know, in New York. The February in 2000, right before spring break, is when we found out that the jury in Albany, because they moved the trial to Albany, acquitted the 4 officers that were charged with the murder. That spring break, I rode on a bus with a predominantly white community of people who rode crew at Williams to South Carolina, to the south. And My experience doing that, I felt like I couldn't talk to anyone on the bus about what I just spent the last few weeks at Williams protesting and shouting in a megaphone about. And so that really piqued my interest, both emotionally and I think on a personal level, around why am I really, I have zero problems talking about race. I feel like it's a big part of, not only a part of my life, but a big part about how I was trained and taught to think about the world. But so many other people don't. And over time, I started to think about it as well. You know, that's, I guess, if other people don't like doing it and you like doing it, perhaps you can serve some kind of role being a facilitator. So most of my university career at Williams, I spent doing things like facilitating freshman programming around multicultural discourse. I forget what that's called. I spent so much time at the Multicultural Center. I lived at Rice House. And the piece of that was important to me, you know, my penultimate summer and my penultimate winter study at Williams, I spent in two very different archives. I spent the summer in what is now referred to as the Marcella Peacock archive. At the time, it was just all the cool stuff in Marcella's office that she had collected over her career at the then Multicultural Center, that's now the Davis Center, processing it, cataloging it, watching everything, making the labels, creating, you know, a book and a documentation of everything that existed in her office. That was really a beautiful love letter to the ways in which Williams students had labored around building community for themselves. That archive has now been migrated to the college archive in the library. I spent the winter study of my senior year really connecting to, well, in order to do a 99, myself and the rest of the BSU board proposed a winter study that was basically us writing the history of Black folks at Williams. So it was a communal history. I was rereading it yesterday. It's more prose than history. It is very slight on citations and footnotes. Oh, I realize it's like the audio is good, but I'm gonna keep going. And my particular chapter, again, as I was rereading it, I wrote the first chapter in the text, was about myth and story. And how do we tell the story of Gaius Boland? How do we talk about his brother, who really ended up coming to Williams just so that Gaius would have someone to stay within the dorms? You know, this is what Black solidarity looks like at Williams. He left after, you know, 2 years because he didn't need to be there anymore to facilitate Gaius's kind of dorm life. And the piece, the important part of that to me was not only having done that work and learning that history and doing it collectively with, you know, my community, really it was 15 of us, but also leaving that, being able to leave that with folks, being able to leave that with, you know, members in classes behind us who had participated in the project, who continued it. And so I say all that, I'm rambling, not following my notes. I say all that to say, I never left Williams saying, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be an EDI professional. I left Williams saying, I'm going to be a philosopher. I'm going to study Hegel, Kant, and Marx. And I'm going to study, I'm going to do, you know, study the Marxism of the Caribbean political sphere. And I left Williams after working there for a year, went straight to a PhD program. And about 5 years after I started, I had a mental health crisis and I had to leave. And so, you know, going through that and experiencing that and grappling with the difficulty of knowing that you can do something but not being able to find the reserves to do it, led me to ask myself, well, what's easy for you? Sharifa, what's the thing that when you do it, you have zero concerns about your aptitude, zero concerns or nervousness around your ability to do it? And in asking myself that question, I ended up working on some projects to stave off unemployment with the Gender Bureau in the Office of the Prime Minister in Jamaica. We won a big grant. I got retained to manage that project. That project was very specifically focused on looking at gender equality because, again, Jamaica is a predominantly Black country. We definitely have issues of race and racism to challenge, to deal with, but what EDI work looked like in Jamaica and the Caribbean was mostly examining and unpacking and trying to address issues of gender inequality, dealing with gender-based violence, dealing with kind of discrimination on the basis of sexuality. So that was my work and my world until Mike Reed, class of 1975, and Brooks Fail, class of 1988, encouraged me to take a look at a job that is a continuation of the work of Paula Morteba, class of 76, in the Alumni Relations Office that was focused on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And, you know, to me, this is an opportunity to work at a place that I like, quite like. I've, you know, concerns and criticisms of Williams, but I quite like the place. A place that I had good archival knowledge and memory of, and a place that I actually also wanted to have an experience of remembering, and remembering a way that is more about remembering. How do I reconstitute, rebuild this experience for myself now that I know more, know better, understand more, have more critical, theoretical, and social knowledge about the dynamics of race in the US versus in the Caribbean versus in Canada, where I went to grad school. The interesting thing about that is Mike Reed called me one day and he said, here's how I know you're supposed to do this job. He said, I was going through the archive, the Marcella Peacock archive, and I saw a video of you leading a, you know, it must have been a discussion around race and activism at Williams. And he said, well, and I said to myself, she can do this. I want her to apply. I want her to think about doing this work. And likely that is a part of an archive that I worked on the summer before my senior year that Mike ended up referencing to me. The work I did at Williams ultimately led me to wanting to do more work in education. And, you know, this work I'm doing now, which is to build an EDI program from scratch for a university that's only 17, 18 years old, is, you know, interesting and exciting and frustrating in many ways. I am grateful that I'm able to do work that I truly enjoy. But, you know, I think to follow the question of how is this work different in light of, you know, what everyone refers to as, you know, racial justice moment, inflection point, reckoning of 2020. To be honest, there's a lot of frustration that I have. It feels like whiplash sometimes, you know, to have, particularly when dealing with communities and people for whom, you know, 2 months before last summer, it was really hard to get folks to listen, to get folks to pay attention, to understand the value. And a big part of how I try to engage in this work at an organizational level is to get folks to spend the money, to invest resources into this work. And so it felt like out of nowhere, you know, everyone wanted to be a part of this work. Everyone wanted to be engaged in this work, and understanding that that is what is needed for a kind of cycle of remembering and repairing to happen, but also feeling, for me, a little bit confused, and probably still a little confused about why now but not when Tamir Rice was murdered. Why now but not when, you know, Amadou was murdered? Not now, you know, why now but not when Sandra Bland was murdered? And I kind of chalk it up sometimes to just, you know, the compounding impact of the pandemic and people having more of an attention span. But that also, you know, when I think about it that way, that leads me to be committed to a level of consistency and repetition, and not only committing to my own memory and my own archive, but also building an archive for others, so that when they don't hear the first time, they may hear the 33rd time. But then it leads me to think about the institutional work as really more valuable and more important than the people work. Listen, I don't dislike people. People, however, are hard for me. People have always been hard for me. I ended up in a workspace and doing work that was very people forward, you know, but because of that, I had to consistently balance for myself how do I structure my work in such a way that I can institutionalize something, and that reduces the amount of labor one has to put into hearts and minds. You know, sometimes I talk about the way people turn to me. I'm a tall, big Black woman. You know, there's a way that people reach for me for comfort, which is not always the easiest thing for me to do. But how do I balance those demands, the emotional demands of this work, the psychological demands of this work, of dealing with interacting with people all the time, and having to manage that, is being able to spend equal or greater time thinking about how do I shift the onus to the organization? How do I get systemic things shifted and changed? How do I get budget allocated? You know, how do I get staffing allocated? How do I advocate for a complete reorganization of how we do things? Because what's wrong, in part, is how we do things. You know, people being racist to me is less dangerous than systems being racist. You know, organizations being racist, communities functioning and operating in ways that you know, assume deficit because of how people are racialized and monetized. So I focus every day. I wake up and I'm like, where is the institution, the community, the university? No one can hear me. My internet is unstable.
You're back. We can hear you now.
So I'm going to end there. And I'm going to say that, you know, I think in many ways, I have been gifted the opportunity of learning and studying and engaging in this work in really difficult ways with an incredible community of folks that I got from Williams. But I look forward to learning and studying more, and hoping we invest in remembering as a pathway to repairing, as a pathway to actually looking at and confronting and reconciling with history and histories. And I am excited that that's a theme for Claiming Williams, because I think it's the most important work we need to do. The end. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to say a couple words while we wait to see if a few more questions come in. We've got a couple. I want to just say that personally, how we each position ourselves in order to address racism, racial injustice has always interested me. And I just want to say that as a student at Williams, I was involved and helped co-lead Spark, Students Promoting Awareness, Respect, and Community. We worked on and off campus. We worked in our local schools around Williamstown. And when I left Williams, I went to teach at a public elementary school. That's where I was first exposed to the grave inequities that existed for Black and Brown children, which meant a lack of resources, food, healthcare, and just basic access to education. I knew I needed to drive systemic change at that point. When I went to work at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, I saw a lot, I heard a lot, and I therefore came to this role with racial justice and social justice lenses. And it's through those lenses that I actually advance the work that I do. But my life experiences have meant that I've rarely been surprised by the racial injustice and equity that permeates throughout so many of our lives. I was, as a child, surprised to see certain things like Rodney King's Black body being beaten on camera for the world to see. Couldn't believe that Abner Louima was sodomized in a New York City police station by the police. And those were surprising to me as a daughter of a civil rights activist and leader. But when I learned that this country was built on nearly 4 centuries of legalized racial segregation, I came to understand exactly why those things happened then and why they happen just as easily now, thus the murder of George Floyd and countless others. So therefore, I'm gonna bring it back to how I started a minute ago, how we each position ourselves in order to address racism, racial injustice has always interested me. And for some, I wanna be clear that addressing for some means eliminate it. For others, it doesn't mean eliminate it, sadly. And with that, I'm gonna turn and ask the first question to our panelists. What resources and actions do you most recommend to break down systems of oppression?
I can hop in unless Ali or Sharifa, you're
Please, Sabine, take it away.
Get in there.
I'm sure everybody up here has something to say.
I was going to say, I imagine our collective list could actually be 1 million pages long. But I will, short and sweet, a couple things. I think one, so actually before I talk about resources, I really want to emphasize one thing. There is an article that came out in the Washington Post earlier that says this better than I will. I think the headline is "When Black People Are in Pain, White People Join Book Clubs." And I say that because I think so often one of the myths of racism is that it's so complicated and it's so sensitive and iffy that folks understandably react with like, okay, I need to really like sit back and learn my stuff. And yes, please learn everything you absolutely can learn. But if it is helpful, I think thinking about the current pandemic has often been an analogy I've used to help folks think about this, where systemic racism is a literal pandemic in the sense that it has a death count, in the sense that it is hurting people, systems, communities at an enormous daily and urgent level. And I say that because I think it can be helpful to apply that metaphor to your understanding of how you're engaging with challenging systemic racism, right? Which is to say, I'm not an expert on COVID. I do not have the public health answers, but I still know it's a devastating issue and I change my behavior accordingly based on what I know to try to mitigate harm and help other folks, ideally not be harmed at all, but be able to survive a situation in an ongoing, massive, dangerous problem that is affecting all of us. And so I caveat that just to say resources, important. Do not ever let the resources be in place of continual small action and behavioral changes that every single person can make. I will actually drop into the chat. I have a folder of like 8 resources I tend to give folks who are early in their work. And just, I think they can be really easily used in different capacities. You should be able to access that Google folder. I will say the last thing in there, White Supremacy Culture from Kenneth Jones and Tim Okun, is one I think is especially useful for folks as you think about the ways in your work or in your interactions with other people that you can shift your behavior to again be actually working in service of anti-racism. The other couple things, I know I talked a little bit about this, so I will blow through my little list here. But again, thinking about the power you as an individual have in the choices you make. I love that Sharifa brought up money is a huge part of this. And I think so often we don't want to talk about that because one of the myths that keeps racism alive is this idea that it's just about thoughts and feelings and having certain things in place, having, visual, optical diversity. Sure. But really, in our capitalist society, financial power is critical to actually talking about a system in which people of different races and people of different backgrounds, in fact, are moving towards equity, because equity in this country does have a lot to do with the financial power that you have and the financial backing you have. And so I say that to name, again, purchasing power is huge. I, as much as possible, do not buy anything on Amazon and try to buy it instead from local Black businesses in my neighborhood. I don't always succeed. Some things are hard to find. But again, thinking about the small, especially Black-owned businesses that sell many of the things that we can easily, often reflexively buy from something else or someone else. I think in line with financial power, as much as possible, I really encourage folks to give directly. And what I mean by that is there is a mistrust of those who live in poverty, of those who are not white, particularly of Black Americans, and of other groups of people. And what I mean by that is a mistrust that means I trust this big charity more than I trust a person asking me for help, who falls into those categories. And I name that because I think you really want to get your bang for your buck. Give directly to people. That can be bail funds, that can be GoFundMes, donors choose. Look at the organizations that you give to and look to see who is running them. Politics is huge here. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I think folks get it. And the last thing I will say is, one resource I recommend a lot to folks lately is a book that is not explicitly actually about racism. It's called No Hard Feelings, The Power of Emotions at Work. It is the absolute best book I have ever seen on how to actually create an equitable and inclusive workplace. It is super actionable, it is super accessible, and it is smart and full of research and full of strategies. And I say that because so often the things you could do to be advancing DEI in whatever spaces you occupy doesn't mean that you need to suddenly become an expert on systemic oppression. It means sometimes thinking about who is talking in meetings, whose ideas are being heard or not heard, that you could be using your voice to amplify, who is being rewarded for taking initiative or diminished quietly for not taking initiative. Where are there places where you can become more cognizant of some of those racial biases and challenge them? Because that is everywhere. And those small shifts that you make individually, in many ways, to me, will matter a lot more than I think what we often turn to in moments like this. The last thing I will say is really commit to personal debiasing. The reading, the learning, all of it is only truly effective if you are willing to come to a place where you can face the biases that you, like all of us, have been conditioned to uphold. And the only way you do that is with a lot of really hard reflection and work. The book Blind Spot can be helpful for that. The Harvard Implicit Association tests are free online if you want to take one measure to see where your biases might be. Glenise L. Pike has a weekly guided journal that you can purchase to really be doing, again, like meaningful reflection that helps you push on those individual biases in ways that will allow you to change your behaviors. All right.
Okay, I'm going to jump in and feel free, Ali and Sharifah, but let me just get a couple questions because they're tied to some things that Sabine just mentioned. So we have a question about a workplace environment that is predominantly white with very few people of color there. And there's a question about how you can move the environment forward when there's reluctance on the part of human resources, perhaps because for fear of, the conversations that one might have. And is it important to get executives on board? On the front end, can you start with some courageous or small group conversations with others who are employees? So, and there was a question about what books and resources would be helpful. So that's why I'm jumping to this, because Sabine, you were kind enough to drop that in the chat. But if any of you have thoughts on how to move environments, workplace environments forward in light of those particular challenges, can you please jump in and share?
Yeah, I can start. So, when I think of the things that I believe in the past historically has gotten us to this place, I think there's a massive failure in the HR function, how we train people in AR. I often say to people, my job exists because HR as an enterprise, as a field, has utterly failed. And I don't say that to, throw shade at people who work in HR. I say that to say, if you're in an organization that is predominantly white, that is already a problem, because no community, no mode of work, specialty, intellectual capacities are only influenced and supported by white folks. Even if you think your space is predominantly white because of geography, there's already a problem with that. And in part, I think you always have to get HR in line first. And you also have to have at least your top executive in line, and a signal for me in just transitioning roles was if I didn't hear from the president of the college and the head of HR that there was a commitment to actually doing this work, that I can't come here and waste my time. It's exhausting, this work. I love it, but it is tiring. And so I think as someone who is in an organization, perhaps the best thing you can do is advocate and agitate for an executive and an HR leader or HR function that has EDI capacity, has cultural competency. And those aren't, if you put on a growth mindset cap, those things aren't baked in. People can go out and learn those things to Sabine's point. So I think compliance and frameworks and things you ask people not only voluntarily that they do, but things you say in order to be a member of this community, these are the things that you have to do. And here is the accountability mechanism that we put in place to help you rejoin the community if you mess up and infringe on these values. And I just feel like we've not been strict about those things, but we're strict if people steal. For me, fiduciary responsibility and equitable responsibility in an organization should be at the same level. You won't let me steal from work, so don't let me, only hire a bunch of people that look the same into my team. I'll end it there.
I love that comparison, Sharifah, because it seems like, because it actually is stealing. Like when you're only hiring white people, there's like so much talent that you're missing out on that you're actually cheating the organization practically of what it could be if it actually invited the like multiracial talent pool to be a part of the organization. So I love that comparison. And I think it can be really important to have, I think what we're seeing basically is how it's actually a 21st century skill to be racially competent. And so, sometimes parents, I do parent lectures sometimes on how to talk to white kids about race. And I'm like, what I say is that it's not like this is the good thing to do, or this is like, it's just morally right. It's 21st century competence to be racially competent, to be able to navigate the racial stressors in our society. And many of us in this field saw this summer where lawyers were calling in videographers and newspaper editors, people were saying, I need skills to like talk about race and do race stuff. It was like, oh my gosh, how are we gonna respond to all of this need? Because there was no field this summer in which people didn't feel the pressure to have racial competence. And aside from that one requirement at Williams, it really wasn't required that I be racially competent to get into Williams, to graduate from Williams, to go to any graduate schools, to get most jobs that I've held. And yet today we see that changing. And so I think, you know, part of what you want to do is also convince your executive that it's in the best interest of the organization. And I love what Ibram Kendi says about a white ally. He says, if you could design your perfect white ally, what would they be? And he says, the perfect white ally would understand that it's in their own self-interest to end racism, that they're not doing it for other people, but they're doing it for themselves. And I feel like that's part of what you want your executives to understand. But as Sabine said at the beginning, that's about relationships. It's about like leaning into them in relationship and inviting them to have a growth mindset for themselves and for the organization, that over the next 3 years, they're going to learn and change. And so one other piece from that piece you mentioned, Sabine, about when Black people are in pain, white people join book clubs. I saw that piece by Trey Johnson this summer, and I was like, it's like I saw the title, it's such a provocative title, and I couldn't read it. So I emailed it to myself because I just like felt so much anxiety. Like, I'm a white person who joins book clubs when Black people are in pain, and I encourage other white people to do so. So what am I doing wrong? So I emailed myself the article because I knew I felt called to account. I needed to read it, but I needed to be in a good place. So I read it a few days later. And what he was saying was essentially like, don't just read the book. Build your racial competence. So psychologists define racial competence as more than just knowledge. So knowledge is what happens when you join a book club. Knowledge is what you get from the book. But the other aspects of racial competence in psychology are skills, the actual skills for talking about race, recognizing racism, recognizing it in yourself and also in your sphere of influence, skills for intervening, for talking about race and race. For countering racism, knowledge, skills, self-awareness. How does this live in me? Maybe I'm reading the new Jim Crow and I'm learning a lot about mass incarceration, but how did this history impact me? What was happening to my family and for my family at this time when Black people were being targeted by the state and in an ongoing way? How did we benefit from it? And then how does that make me feel? The self-awareness of how does it make me feel? A long time ago, I realized like, this stuff does make me feel guilty. I know a lot of white people say, I struggle with guilt, I do too. Like this, learning about racism makes me feel guilty. And and I used to tell people, but don't like go there. Like the guilt is not productive. Take action instead. And what I'm realizing is like, actually the guilt is what drives my action. For me, when I feel guilty, I have to look at my life and say like, what is out of alignment that I feel guilty right now? So, because I want to have a right relationship to my community and to my society. And what that means is like, maybe I need to give away more of my money, or maybe I need to live in a different place. Like sometimes guilt really is a sign that something's off. And so the self-awareness is to listen to that. And then the fourth piece is action. So racial competence is the knowledge, skills, self-awareness, and action to be able to recognize racism and intervene with racism. And those are the ways that you take it beyond the book club. And I think in personal relationship with your executives, you could invite them into thinking more, not just about like being anti-racist, but actually building the skills of racial competency so they can recognize racism and intervene with it, and also know that it's something that they can get better at.
Let me just stick with this for a second, Allie, because you mentioned action. One of the questions that we received is directly related to that, and I'm just going to read a part of it. Is it important? So in order to deconstruct systemic racism and discrimination, is it important to get people in dominant positions to be comfortable with moving out of those dominant positions and to recognize that it will be better for everyone to be able to benefit from differences in the ways dominance presents? or prevents. So I just wanted to put that out there because it's directly related to a few things that you've said, Ali, and if anybody has thought, you or Sabine or Sharifah have thoughts on that with regard to action, please share.
I do, but also want to hold for a second if either of you would rather jump in. I will not be offended. I think candidly, I feel like anyone who's been in this work probably, well, I won't speak for other folks, but I think this question comes up a lot, and I have heard folks very aggressively on both sides of it, right? I think there are several folks whose theory of change rests on the idea that you need to change the hearts and minds of those in power. I think I'm more of the school of the Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. I think there's middle ground, and I think often the most important element to me is, I think Leticia, you were talking about this before, but your position from which you're approaching the work. And I say that as someone who, you know, in my current role and when I work as a consultant, I am in a power dynamic and explicit partnership. And the way that that is quite explicitly focused on engaging folks who hold positional and other power and working with them to actually see, frankly, some redistribution or shifting of that power as desirable, beneficial, and necessary is very different from the work I have done in community organizing, which is much more about bringing voices of marginalized folks together and exerting pressure in a way that changes the self-interest of those who are dominant in a specific scenario or hold the power, but it's quite different from the sort of hearts and minds approach. And so I think, ideally, I think you have folks doing all of it because that leads to change from different angles. But I think one thing I often talk with folks a lot about is really thinking about whose comfort and whose preferences are being prioritized. I think often when we are talking about meeting people where they're at, and meeting especially folks who are white where they're at, meeting leadership, and especially white leadership where it's at, there is often part of that dominance is that we are talking about a group of folks and their comfort or their pace of change or other things are being prioritized. And it's worth thinking about whose needs, who is being urgently discriminated against, traumatized, hurt, looked over, because their comfort is not being taken as seriously as a dominant group. So I do want to throw that out there. I will also say, just both to this question and the last thing that came up about executives, as someone who spends a lot of time pushing on white executives, happy to always talk about this in a different context. But one thing I will name is I have a lot of feelings about consultants, and I am one. Mostly you can sum up my feelings with, there's a lot you can do without a consultant. Don't wait for them. I think one place where I really do encourage, and I've actually gotten our organization to bring in consultants, is on executive coaching, because it is especially difficult for someone at the top of an organization to talk honestly, candidly, vulnerably, and confidentially with someone who directly or indirectly works for them or with them. And so to create some of the psychological safety to actually do that debiasing work for executives in particular is somewhere where I actually really encourage folks to contract executive coaches who they can have those conversations with in a way that they just can't with other folks in the organization.
Great.
I want to echo the executive coaching message from Sabine, because I really think that's an important tool and important mechanism to help people along the way in ways that actually will benefit the organization. The other thing I will say to this point of dominance and overrepresentation, particularly if we're talking about the corporate sector, is to address board dominance is easier to address sometimes than overrepresentation of whiteness at the executive level or at the hired level. I really think sometimes if that question is pitched from someone who's thinking about how to help an organization move along, think about who's on the board, because the board turns over There is always a highly qualified pool of folks who are not white men named John, who could sit on the board and chair the board. And if someone's on a board, they probably have multiple board seats. So you displacing them is really not a big deal to them. So, you know, attack it at the board level first, but also, trust me, privilege finds privilege. People will be okay if we displace them and find people to coach into those roles who are underrepresented.
Okay, great. So let me ask another question that I see came up. How do you care for self, essentially, when you see and are affected by systemic racism and as part of the job, as part of your job? When you're charged, in particular, with educating people, implementing DEI policies in a predominantly white environment or a predominantly white institution. There's a related question that also has to do with pushing for institutional change while being employed by the institution. So I just wanted to package those up, and we've only got about 7 minutes left, and there may be one or two more questions for you. I guess that's the
like a young upstart who keeps jumping in, but I feel like that's disrupting a dialogue rhythm.
Just jump in.
And I got so excited, I forgot the question. Wow.
So self-care and how, especially in light of, okay.
Self-care, you can't fight every battle. If you try to, you will serve absolutely nobody. And so really finding the folks you can confide in, especially outside of the workplace, about the struggles of the work, setting hard boundaries, knowing that DEI labor is labor, and therefore, even though it is for the good of people, that doesn't mean you have to give it to people for free, doesn't mean you have to give it to people on demand. I think there's a lot of that goes around in a way that is inherently inequitable because it deems this labor as not worth compensating or respecting the same way. I think the other thing, wow, I'm really just slipping away. There's something I was so excited to say in this panel, guys.
I can throw something else out and then, or Sharifah, did you have something?
Yeah, two things I want to say about self-care if you're in this role and you're doing this role is, I know different people have complex relationships about therapy and counseling, but I think a big part of my practice and operating at the highest possible level doing this work is that I have a therapeutic relationship that works and is helping me manage the really very real challenges emotionally and psychologically of dealing with other people's emotions about race, because I don't have a problem talking about race. The other thing I will say is self-care means being paid what you're worth. Self-care means having benefits to afford therapy. You know, self-care means taking your days off because you deserve them and you've earned them. So I feel like a big part of being in an organization and taking care of yourself is making sure the organization is taking care of you.
I remembered my point. Also, thanks, Sharifah, for saving me from just ad-libbing indefinitely. My other point was, I think, Leticia, the question you asked raised a really important thing, which is also psychological and professional risk. Pushing, especially pushing as a person of color, especially pushing as a Black person in many organizations, including the one I work at, on DEI in the workplace comes at risk. There's explicit risk like getting fired, but a lot of it is more the implicit discrimination of what is your reputation? What conversations are you no longer being invited to? How are you being seen and promoted and advanced? And so I will say, especially for marginalized folks, it isn't always, please never feel guilty about not picking the battle, because if you did, the stakes are very real. I talk really candidly with our executives about the fact that I think a lot of why I can push as hard as I often do is A, because I am South Asian and that comes with certain privileges, and B, because I have the privilege to do so. I can pay my rent. I don't have children. I live with a partner who massively out earns me. I, in the worst case scenario of professional consequences, would still be okay. And that's not true for everybody. So I think being smart about that, and especially thinking about for white folks who are looking to be allies or co-conspirators, absorbing and taking that professional risk is often not erasing the voice of a colleague of color, and you should talk to them about it, right? Never, it's not great to assume what's going on, but there's so many times where if you are the white person with power in a space, you speaking a thing to your white executive in particular will potentially A, have a bigger impact, and B, you will absorb the professional risk instead of somebody else. And so thinking really actively about that, to me, is also very important to the question you raised, Leticia.
Great. So this is our speed round. So we got like in 30 seconds or less, because we're about to wrap it up. Can you each share something that you would like to see the Society of Alumni do going forward that perhaps is not happening now? Allie?
I honestly, I don't know anything about what the Society of Alumni does. So I don't even know what the range could be. You know, my self-care advice for myself as a white person and for other white folks might play into this, which is this summer I wanted to quit my job and go to law school because I was like, I'm not making enough of a difference. I have to change the law. I have to change policy. This is, you know, education isn't cutting it. And a colleague of mine who's Salish Indian said to me, Allie, like you're going to feel that in law too. You're going to feel that in policy. You're stay where you are, do what you can do in your sphere of influence. You are essential. But remember, decolonization and anti-racism is a daily practice. So like get up every day and practice. But know that you're not going to end racism tomorrow. You're not going to decolonize our country the next day, but every day you're going to do some of it, and you're going to do it in the micro movements. And then you're going to get up the next day and you're going to keep doing it. So I encourage the Society of Alumni to take on this practice. It's not just work. It's not just work for me or for anybody. It's a daily practice of unlearning the racism and colonization that have shaped our society for the last 400 years so that things can be different for our children and our children's 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 children. That's the goal. So hopefully, anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. Sharifah, 30 seconds or less. 6 o'clock.
I mean, obviously I've given a lot of thought to this. The one I will go with is I would like to see the society be the driver in institutional repair, in connecting with the Mohican community that was displaced from Williamstown, but also around repairing harms that have been done to racialized folk who are a part of Williams or a part of the Williamstown community. And that comes with a fiduciary responsibility as well. I want to see alumni drive Williams in that work.
Thank you, Sharifah. Sabine.
Oh man, tough act to follow.
10 seconds or less, I'm kidding.
All right, Grant, here's what I think they should do. I think A, despite everything I've said about learning, it would be fantastic to have a bit of a learning series that helps folks do some of that actually de-biasing and learn the ability to translate into action. The only other thing I'll say is thinking about financial power. I think it would be really powerful for the Society of Alumni to help. You know, I think Williams is still top of Forbes's. We have the highest salary on average of graduates list. And my point is there's a lot of financial power which can translate to real massive gains for anti-racist work and DEI in this country. I imagine there are some pretty good folks in that Society of Alumni space who can help many of our other alumni pursue and learn about the ways that they can act in that space.
Thank you so much, Sabine. So Sharifah, Allie, Sabine, thank you very much for engaging, taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this panel, and for being a resource to the rest of the Williams community. Everyone else, I know that there are other sessions still going on today. Hope you'll enjoy those and continue to participate, and also participate in the rest of the Society of Alumni's Bicentennial throughout this year. Thanks again. Have a fantastic evening and great rest of the week to everyone. And thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye.